Everyone wants to be famous, even if just for 15 minutes. But of course, with fame comes complications. The more people want your time and attention, the more people want you dead. And who could have more notoriety, more fame, more name recognition than Santa Claus himself?
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Tuesday, the Tuesday before Christmas, and I've got another scary story just for you. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and tonight's story is action-packed. Often here on Weekly Spooky, we dive into many of the subgenres of horror. But it's not often action, so leave it to our good buddy Keith Tomlin to take care of business right here tonight with his very fun and freaky story. But we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we get to that, I simply want to say a big thank you for listening to the program. We love what we're doing here at Weekly Spooky. That's why we've done it for nearly 4 full years, and we have no intention of stopping. And this holiday season, we're giving you all kinds of extra things under your tree. Notice I say things and not necessarily gifts. Well, gift is in the eye of the beholder, and once those eyes get jabbed out, well, that's another story for another time. But make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already on your favorite podcasting app. And while you're at it, leave us a 5-star rating. It helps us a lot finding new listeners. Because tomorrow, there's another spooky. Thursday is the Babysitter Massacre audiobook Camp Carnage in its entirety, free. Another Christmas gift to you all. Then Friday is Christmas Arcadia, a brand new Strickfield novella. And then Saturday is something very special for you Strickfield fans. Something you are not going to want to miss. Something that would make you very rageful if you missed it. So make sure you're subscribed and head to weeklyspooky.com to listen to shows you may have missed. But now it's time for our story after these quick words. The Day That Santa Died by Keith Tomlin. Excerpts from Santa's Bodyguard, My Journey from Vietnam to the North Pole, an autobiography by Jonathan L. Copeland, as featured in the December 2011 issue of the Weatherby Monthly True Crime Journal. Writer's note: I hate to start the story off with exposition, but I need to make sure that the realities of the situation are understood by the reader. These are explained in detail in the book version, but readers of this excerpt may benefit from knowing the following. 1. There are around 2,000 elves in existence. The vast majority of these elves are living a happy life, working for Santa. There are, however, a few that, in their terms, escaped from the North Pole. These elves, called renegades, vowed to release their fellow elves from their enslavement of their oppressor. For the record, I have not seen any indication that Santa was anything but kind and generous to those who worked for him. 2. Many supernatural phenomena surround Santa Claus and Christmas. Many of these are well documented in popular culture, such as flying reindeer and circumventing the entire Earth in one night while delivering presents. However, 2 lesser-known ones affect this story. The first is that explosives, including gunpowder and, by extension, firearms, do not work around Santa Claus. The same goes for internal combustion engines. Santa cannot ride in a car, plane, or helicopter. When I asked him about these and other unusual occurrences, he would simply shrug and say, "It's Christmas magic." I could get no further explanations. John Copeland, 2011. December 18th, 1989, Cooper's Department Store, Brickton, New Jersey. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel that something was wrong. This sixth sense saved my life many times in Vietnam, and I've learned to trust it. I triggered the radio. "Steve, how are things looking?" The reply came back. "Everything looks good here, boss." "Alan, everything good on your end?" "Yep, no issues, just kids everywhere," Alan replied. "Dave, how are you doing?" No reply. "Dave." Still no reply. "Jeff?" Again, no reply. "Damn," I sighed. I triggered the radio again. "Okay, Alan, I want you to stop letting people in. Tell them that Santa has to feed his reindeer or whatever. Steve, make your way towards Dave's sector, but be careful. Head on a swivel. I'll head to where Jeff was." After Alan and Steve confirmed, I head off down an aisle stacked with boxes of board games. A look to my right confirmed that Santa was still in the Winter Wonderland village that Cooper's department store set up for him. Kids were lined up across the sales room floor and down the unpowered escalator. I heard tiny footsteps running behind me. I turned and walked back towards sporting goods. A blur of motion turned down an aisle in the baseball section. I quickly covered the ground between me and the mouth of the aisle. Peering around the corner, I saw a child no older than 6 standing there, giggling, his mouth covered in chocolate. I cautiously made my way towards him. "Hi there. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" I asked. "They over there," he said, pointing somewhat in the direction of Santa's village. I approached closer, every nerve screaming. "What are you doing here? Don't you want to meet Santa?" "The little man gave me candy and said that you wanted to play hide and seek," the child said, grinning. I began to answer when my instincts told me to duck. A long blade whipped across the aisle, barely missing my head. Out of habit and training, my hand reached for a pistol at my waist. I then remembered I was not carrying a firearm and instead grabbed a wooden baseball bat just in time to block another strike from the short sword. The sword dug into the wood deep enough to catch, and I was able to twist the bat to the side and rip that sword out of the grip of a short creature standing on the top shelf. I dropped the bat and grabbed its legs, turned and swung it across the aisle, hitting its head on a metal bin full of baseball bats. I let go and it landed on the floor, its neck twisted at an impossible angle. I heard the kid behind me running away, yelling for his mother. I got my first look at the creature and cursed. It was around 3 feet tall, with a thin, narrow face, long gray beard, and pointy ears. "Guys," I said into the radio, "we got elves. Time to shut it down. Alan, they don't usually attack civilians, but make sure everybody makes it safely off the property. Steve, make your way to me. I'll be with the big guy." Immediately, the guys acknowledged. I changed channels and radioed to have the reindeer sleigh sent for a roof extraction. As I began to quickly walk toward the Winter Wonderland setup, I tripped a fire alarm mounted on a wall. Sirens and flashing lights filled the store as a pre-recorded voice played over the sound system, asking all guests to leave the building in an orderly fashion via the nearest exit. In the Winter Wonderland set, store employees began helping crying children and worried parents exit the roped-off queue. Santa, looking majestic in his classic red robes with white trim, was reassuring everyone and asking them to be careful on the way out. I walked up to Santa, my eyes trying to scan everyone and everything at once, my nerves screaming. Santa noticed my approach and turned to me, concern etched into his ageless face. "John, my boy, what is going on? Is everyone okay?" he asked, his deep voice rising above the surrounding chaos. I shook my head. "No, sir. The renegades are here. I have a few people missing, but I haven't heard any issues with the civilians." "Oh my," he said, pausing. "How did they find me?" "Unclear at this point," I replied. "Around Christmas, there are thousands of actors posing as Santa around the world, meeting children, leading parades, and doing other Christmassy duties. For years, I tried in vain to get the real Santa to cancel his personal appearances, but he refused, saying that the only way to know what children really want is to get out there and talk to them. I was able to stop him from announcing his appearances, hoping that the sheer number of other Santas would act as decoys and serve as a form of Christmas camouflage. "We can worry about that later, sir. Now we need to get you to the roof for pickup," I told him. "I'll go once I know the children are safe," he replied. "Sir, we need to get you out of here." "When the children are safe," Santa said with a bit of an edge in his voice. Roger that. I knew that once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. I turned to face the dwindling crowd, scanning for dangers. I spoke into the radio. "Alan, what's the situation?" Alan answered, a bit breathless. "The crowd streaming out of the building is thinning out a bit. I saw some short figures, non-children, entering through the loading dock. Steve went after them." "Stay with the crowd. Make sure nothing happens to them," I said. "Steve, head up to me." No answer. "Steve." Still nothing. Damn, I thought, as I put the radio into a holster on my belt. After a few tense minutes, some of the longest of my life, Alan's voice came over the radio. "Boss, employees are saying the store should be empty." "Roger that. Heading to the roof," I replied. That's when the lights went out. The world went black except for the flashing lights of the fire alarm. Moments later, the emergency lights came on, their dim, pale lights combined with the firelights casting an eerie shadow. "Sir," I said, "we need to go now." A somber-looking Santa nodded. "Yes, John, I believe you're right." Weaving through the aisles and holiday displays, I led Santa toward the back stairway. As we entered housewares, 3 diminutive figures emerged out of the darkness at the end of the aisle, the amber alarm lights shining off of the short steel swords they were wielding. I pulled Santa behind me and turned to face the attackers. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw a dark shape launch itself from the top shelf toward Santa. I sidestepped to intercept, putting my body between Santa and the threat. I raised my left arm to block the assault, and a long, thin blade pierced my forearm. The weight of the small body forced my arm back, and the tip of the knife cut a long, cruel gash in my cheek. I grabbed the attacker, an older gray-haired elf, with my right hand and awkwardly chucked the flailing body at the other 3, who were now running down the aisle, swords raised.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
One of the attackers tripped over the thrown elf while the other 2 slowed down, now that I had turned my attention to them. As they cautiously walked forward, I pulled the knife from my forearm, causing a fresh wave of blood to flow. I held the knife at the ready. As a Green Beret in Vietnam, my unit was often at a numeric disadvantage when we encountered the enemy. In those situations, I found that it was best to cause confusion in the enemy by doing the unexpected, which usually came down to a quick and bloody display of extreme violence. I whispered to Santa, "Keep an eye out behind you. I'll be right back." I didn't wait for an answer. Instead, I roared at the top of my lungs and began to run towards the elves as fast as I could. This startled them, and they raised their swords in a defensive posture. As I got within a few feet of the elf on the right side, I went into a feet-first baseball slide, the polished and waxed floor assisting me with a surprising lack of resistance. I hit him just under his right knee. The crack of the bones was louder than the fire alarm. As he fell, he tried to strike me, but only took out a small slice of my left arm. Most of the damage was absorbed by my suit jacket. At this time, I realized that I had slid too close to the bottom of the shelf, and it was restricting my movements. My initial hope was to take out the right elf with the baseball slide, then spin to face away from the upright attacker and use my feet to keep him at bay until I can find an opportunity to stand up. Not the best plan I've ever come up with, but better than none. The middle attacker approached and batted away my ineffectual attempts to fend him off with my injured arm. He raised his sword and plunged it down at me. At the last moment, I was able to turn and took the strike on my left side. Using what little strength I had in my left arm, I tried to push him away as he grabbed the sword with both hands and leaned into it. That's when I stopped pushing and pulled him toward me, his sword passing through me and striking the floor. Shock showed on his face as he fell forward, unable to compensate for the lack of resistance. I stared into his face inches from mine as I brought my right hand up and plunged the dagger into his side over and over again. I felt the front of my shirt grow wet with his blood, and the light in his eyes slowly dimmed. I let go and he slumped over, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Using the shelves to pull myself up, I grasped the hilt of the small sword and pulled it free, wincing from the pain. Rolling my left shoulder, I deduced that the wound on my side was less serious than I originally thought. No vital organs were hit. I look at the 3 living elves lying on the ground. The one with the broken leg was still clutching it and rolling around, moaning. The one I threw was still lying, dazed on the tile floor, while the one that tripped over him was just rising to his feet, his cold eyes boring into me. I took a step and kicked him hard in the face. A wet crunch could be heard as a shelf split the back of his skull open and wedged into his brain. I then struck the elf he tripped over with the sword until he stopped moving. I verified that the elf with the broken leg wasn't a threat before looking over at Santa. Santa Claus stood there, speechless, his ashen white face registering both shock and disgust. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Sir, we should be going," I said, looking around for additional threats. Santa shook his head like he was coming out of a trance. He looked at the carnage in front of him and asked, "Was that necessary?" "Sir, let's go," I replied. Santa took one last look at the bodies before him and slowly nodded. We made our way past the jewelry counter and into women's wear. I grabbed a couple of scarves from a bin and bound my wounds as best I could. Santa gave me a disapproving look, but softened when I told him that I would pay for them later. I almost added "if we live," but chose to keep that part to myself. We heard movement behind us, at least 4 sets of footsteps heading our way. I began pushing Santa to move faster, hoping to reach the stairway to the roof before the renegades caught us. My 6th sense was screaming that there was something I was missing, but years of inaction had blunted the tactical sense that had been honed into a razor's edge in foreign wars. Finally, I saw the gap in the shelves along the back wall with a bright red sign that read "Emergency Exit." As we neared it, something flew by and smacked into the wall ahead of us. I looked back, and a small figure was frantically trying to reload a crossbow. I pushed Santa faster, almost knocking him off his feet, and we slammed into a metal exit door. A shrill alarm began going off, further adding to the chaos of the situation. I slammed the door shut and looked around. Stairs were going up on the left and down on the right. Also on the right was a mop and bucket. I grabbed the mop and wedged it between the bottom step and the door. It wouldn't last long, but it should slow them down. Santa was trying to catch his breath and, as much as I hated to do it, I couldn't give him time to rest. "Sir, the roof is 1 flight up. We're almost there," I said as reassuringly as I could. He nodded and began climbing. I did my best to keep watch both ahead and behind us. When we made the turn to the final set of stairs, I began hearing yells and pounding from below. I readied the sword that I still carried and prompted Santa to climb even faster. When we finally made it to the roof access door, we paused. I pushed Santa against the wall and stood in front of him, sword at the ready. I radioed the reindeer team. "What's the status of the sleigh?" I asked. "We're landing now. The roof is clear. We're a go," was the reply. I sighed. Finally, something was going our way. "Ready, sir?" I asked Santa. He chuckled. "I can almost taste the hot chocolate now." As I nodded to him, I heard a crash from below us and yells of triumph. Santa opened the roof door, and I followed close behind him, facing the stairway. As soon as I backed onto the roof, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until later that I realized that it was the lack of noise. 9 reindeer make a ton of noise, even when they're just standing still, and the roof was eerily quiet. As I heard Santa say, "Oh my," I turned and noticed an odd contraption set off to the left. It had a 4-inch tube and 2 large tanks behind it. 3 elves were standing around it, two holding long daggers while the third carried a short spear. One elf yelled, "Now!" and the one with the spear brought it down on a lever, and the machine roared. I suddenly realized that this was a huge air cannon. A metal ball shot out, flying towards Santa's chest. I tried to leap in front of him to intercept the threat, but it seemed like I was moving in slow motion. I was able to get my left arm up in front of the cannonball. It ricocheted off of my arm, shattering bone, and struck Santa in the stomach. I fell to the ground and must have blacked out for a few seconds. When I came to, I saw that Santa was lying on the roof about 6 feet away, flanked by the 3 elves from the cannon. Another 3 elves were approaching from the other side of the roof, and 4 more had emerged from the stairway. Still dazed, I watched the elves surround Santa, who lay there, gasping for breath. The elf with the spear stepped forward and jammed it into Santa's chest. That broke the dam, and the others rushed ahead, plunging their knives into the large man over and over again. Blood began to pool on the roof, and the elves' handmade boots made red footprints as they splashed through the puddle, eagerly elbowing their way through the frenzied mob to take another stab. I gave up trying to stand and slumped back to the ground, all of my will to fight drained out of me. I screamed, but the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the soft, wet thud of the knives hitting their mark. I hung my head and wept, but soon the sounds of the slaughter stopped. I thought that I would look up to find myself surrounded by bloodthirsty heathens. However, when I opened my eyes, I saw that the elves had backed up, staring at the body on the ground. Lights began pulsing from each of the dozens of Santa's wounds. The light became brighter, and the elves stumbled back further, one falling down, but none of them took their eyes off of the corpse in front of them. Santa's body began to shake and rose in the air like some rag doll held up by an invisible hand. The light became blinding, and I had to turn away from the blazing nova that the fatman had become. There was a loud crackle and then a deafening thump, followed by a light so bright that it rivaled the sun. After a few minutes, I opened my eyes and tried to blink away the spots that danced in front of them. Santa's body still hung in the air, but the light was beginning to dim as his wounds slowly closed. I was struck by the thought that he looked like a white, bearded Jesus crucified on an invisible cross. I felt like I was going mad and began to laugh. That stopped when I noticed the charred and smoking bodies of the renegade elves scattered around the roof. Hearing a scraping sound, I turned to see that one of the elves survived. Most of its body was charred, and it was using its one good arm to pull itself along. I stumbled to my feet, the pain in my arm and side beginning to throb as the adrenaline wore off. I shuffled over to the remaining elf and flipped it over onto its back. The majority of its face was burnt black, except for the area around its right eye. I could feel the hate radiating from it as it looked past me, focused on something behind me. "Oh, Clarence," Santa said, walking up to look down at the elf. "My poor boy, I wish I could help you." "Help?" Clarence croaked between charred lips. "Let us go." Santa shook his head. "If I could, I would, but it's out of my control." "Liar! Set us free," Clarence said, his anger giving strength to his voice. Santa got down on one knee and grabbed Clarence's good hand. "You don't think I've tried to leave? It affects me, just like it affects you. After 2 days away from the North Pole, I start feeling the tug of the place, trying to pull me back. After a week away, I can't sleep. I can barely eat. And that's just the start of the struggle. All I can think of is my workshop and my overwhelming need to get back to it. I finally just accepted my fate and embraced my role in life. We bring joy to the children of the world, and that's a worthy way to spend one's life. Doubt showed in Clarence's face, and he whispered a final word. Who? Santa patted his hand. It's the spirit of Christmas that calls to us, that pulls us back. Its magic is fueled by the hopes and dreams of children all over the world. As long as there are children who believe in Christmas, the Christmas spirit will be there to guide us. Santa stopped talking as a groan escaped from Clarence's mouth, and the light in his eyes went out. Santa bowed his head and wept. After a few minutes, he gently placed the elf's hand on the ground and stood, wiping his face. I radioed the sleigh team and, after verifying their identification, found that they never received the original request for a rooftop pickup. After scheduling the pickup, I turned to Santa and noticed that he was poking a finger through one of the dozens of cuts in his jacket. "John?" he said, confused. "What happened?" "Well, sir, you died," I replied. "Did I know?" "So how did I undie?" he asked. "Unclear. You started floating in the air and burst into a bright light, and now you're alive." "Really? Strange." Santa shrugged. "Christmas magic," he said. "Yes, sir. Christmas magic." Epilogue. In the dark space between two air units, Frederick the elf lowered the crossbow and placed it next to the backpack of the electronic equipment he used to intercept the radio transmissions. He tore his gaze off Santa and closed his eyes to quell his rage. With that rage subsiding, the pull of the north returned. He spent a few minutes conquering that urge, his shaking hands finally growing still. Calm descended and he began to review what he learned. Santa can't be killed, at least not in traditional ways. Santa is not the source of the pull, but he is a willing participant in the oppression of the elves. The spirit of Christmas is the force that tries to pull them back to the North Pole. Human children all over the world give power to the spirit of Christmas. To lessen the pull of the spirit of Christmas, we need to decrease what gives it power, namely, human children. Frederick opened his eyes. He knew what he had to do. Now is the time for planning. He cocked his head and seemed to hear sleigh bells off in the distance. He took one last look at Santa and his bodyguard before slinking off into the darkness. Thank you for reading the Weatherby Monthly True Crime Journal. Please check out next month's issue, where we will have the next installment of excerpts from John Copeland's autobiography. In that article titled Infanticide, Generation Blood, he explores one of the bloodiest terror campaigns in human history. Well, it looks like things may have gotten a lot worse. Leave it to our good buddy Keith Tomlin to give us one of the darkest endings possible. If you haven't heard his other holiday offerings, I do highly recommend you check them out. And it's very easy to listen to authors' other work here at Weekly Spooky. Just go to weeklyspooky.com and click on search. Type in Keith Tomlin and see all of the stories he's written for us over the years. You could also do that with any of our other authors, or if you're into vampires, werewolves, ghosts, zombies, demons, type it in. We have over 230 episodes to dig through. I'm sure there's something you may have missed or would love to revisit. And if you need even more fun and spooky times, why not visit us over on Facebook, where we have our very own Weekly Spooky community called the Weekly Spooky Tomb of Terror. It's free to join, and it's where myself and many of our authors and other spookies hang out, share memes, scary things, and have a really good time. I also want to say thank you so much to our Patreon podcast boosters. These are folks who give to our show every month to make sure the spooky comes on the weekly. And these are our podcast boosters. They pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show. And they are Johnny Nix, John Callan, Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. If you want to join up on Patreon and get exclusive shows and hear your name on the show, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and find a tier that works for you. They start at just $1 a month. So, you know what to do. It'd be a nice little present for me to see us reach 100 Patreon backers. So, will you help me do it? But now, my friends, I gotta get back to work. We have so much more content before the big day. So for myself, my producer Dan Wilder, my executive producer Rob Fields, and my composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.